Hello everyone. When I was asked to speak at this event, I asked the organizers what they would like me to talk about. I'm used to being asked to speak about first-person shooters or programming, and especially my time at id Software, but for this talk, the conference organizers wanted to hear something more. They wanted to hear my story, my history in the game industry. There was something more than that, though. Through my story, they wanted to hear the industry story, games story, where we started, where we've been, where we are, and where we're going. Having been in the industry for over 34 years, that's no small amount of ground to cover. I've done a lot of thinking, a lot of looking at my archives, and a lot of talking with friends. Much of the stuff I'm going to talk about today is about my story. And in thinking it through, this retrospective has illuminated a lot of patterns that I hadn't before seen, and patterns I'll share with you in this talk that'll show us not just where we've been, but where we as the game industry are probably going. So for giving me this tremendous opportunity to look back as well as look forward, I'd like to thank you all. And now I'd like to talk with you about a life in games. I grew up in the desert of Tucson, Arizona. I was born a Mexican and a Native American from the Yaqui tribe on one side of my family. My great-great-grandmother was Naztec. On the other side of my family was part Norwegian, and my great-great-grandmother was Cherokee. I grew up near Saint-Nevere de Bac, an old mission that my family went to on Sundays. My uncle was a minister there. My family was very Catholic. I don't normally talk about my upbringing, but I think it formed an important part of who I am and factored into the games that I made. My mother and my father married quite young. While my family is now known for programming and design, it's also known tremendous success in dealing drugs and drinking vast amounts of alcohol. And unfortunately, death. 3 of my family have been shot and killed due to drinking and drugs. My father even held up a Circle K at gunpoint for my diapers. I don't say any of this to disparage them. My family and my culture is why I have a deep appreciation for fun, laughter, and entertainment. For as long as I can remember, everyone in my family barbecued almost every night over mesquite wood that we got from the desert ourselves, telling stories and drinking till midnight when the coals were finally ready to cook over. In saying this about my dad, he was my dad and I loved him very much, and he passed away from alcohol and drug addiction in 2005, on the same day that he was born at age 57. He didn't leave much behind. My mother eloped with my father over her racist father's objections, even though his ancestry had Cherokee blood. I spent my first 8 years growing up in the desert on the south side of Tucson, Arizona, in the Mexican barrio. My family was not at all into games. For entertainment, I played in the dirt, in the desert, with the local animals. If I wanted entertainment, I had to make it out of nothing. But in 1976, a Pong console materialized in my grandmother's house on a black and white TV. It was mesmerizing to see something that I controlled move on the TV screen. And it was the first time I played a video game, and I was 8 years old. In 1976, I discovered pinball in an arcade named Spanky's in Tucson. It was dark, cool, and had about 30 pinball machines in there. Then one day, they put this cabinet against the wall opposite the pinball machines. It was big, and it was called Dune Buggy. One look inside the cabinet through the glass told me that this was new and amazing. It used a black light, and it looked surreal. One look inside the cabinet through the glass told me this was new and amazing. It used a black light and looked surreal. I'd never seen a game look so interesting before. There looked like what appeared to be a ghostly Jeep that I drove around the landscape trying to avoid a car on the road. They used the Pepper's Ghost trick that's used in the Haunted Mansion at Disneyland. At this time, my wandering through the deserts of Tucson came to an end as my parents got divorced. My mom found a new husband after a year or so, and we moved out of Arizona. It was still 1976 when we moved to Rocklin, California, a sleepy suburban town of about 6,000 people. Unbeknownst to me, it was very close to where much of the work in the early game industry would begin. There were some places in Rockland where arcade games were beginning to appear. All the games were about shooting aliens or asteroids. Space Invaders was a huge game. At this time, the computer game industry was still very early. The first wave of computers were out. The TRS-80, the Commodore PET, and the Apple II. The computer game industry was started on these three computers. They call it the Holy Trinity. But mainly it was the Apple II, which had color graphics, sound, and was the birthplace of many of the genres that games developed along. The Apple II also influenced the next wave of home computers, but they wouldn't come along for a few years. Some of the earliest games on home computers started appearing in the few new software stores in 1977. The earliest games were on cassette tapes before disk drives were available on the Apple II in 1978. However, I was still playing with Tinker Toys, Lincoln Logs, and Erector sets. I had no idea home computers existed. I was just a normal kid going to primary school. I played down by the creek with my brother and my friends like any other normal kid. We played lots of Dungeons and Dragons. We rode our BMX dirt bikes everywhere without helmets. It was a great time I'll never forget. Then, one day in the summer of 1979, my brother and my friend Robert rode to my house on their bikes, excitedly told me that they found a place where we could play games that didn't cost any money. Well, I got on my bike and I followed them immediately. It was about a 45-minute bike ride all the way to Sierra College, the community college in Rockland. It was the summer of 1979. Outside it was 38 Celsius and few students were on campus. We made it our way to the computer science building where it was a balmy 15 Celsius. In one room they had Burroughs computers and Wang computers. No one was using them for some reason. But in one room where an old mainframe computer was taking up all the space, the room right next to it was filled with about 25 terminals all connected to the mainframe, and this is where a few college students were doing some of their projects. Robert showed me some old university text games like Hunt the Wumpus, Nim, Poison Cookie, and several others. We came back almost every day that summer. It was amazing that none of the students questioned the fact that two 11-year-olds were playing around on the university terminals. Sometimes if the terminals were all filled up, we played games on the teletype machine, which is basically playing a game where every turn is a computer printout on paper of the entire screen. After the glamour of the text games wore off very quickly, I started to pay attention to what the students were doing on the terminals. Robert told me that they were writing programs. I started to ask students what the words meant. I wrote them down, and then I started to experiment with them on my own. Before long, I had an HP Basic manual and started writing my very first adventure game. The summer was over, but my interest in programming computers was piqued. By the summer of 1980, Sierra College opened up a new room and filled it with new Apple II computers. I spent the next couple summers going in and programming them. I was also telling my new stepfather all the cool things I was learning. 1980 is also the year I started spending a ton of time in arcades. Every week, new arcade games were being released. It was a Cambrian explosion of game design. It was really a wonder to behold. I played all the new machines when they came in, but I spent a majority of my time around this game, Pac-Man. The first time I saw Pac-Man was at the Foothills Bowling Center in Auburn, California. It was brand new, it was color, and you did not kill aliens with a ship. You were a yellow mouth chomping dots while 4 colored ghosts chased you around the maze trying to stop you. If you ate a power pill, you could turn the tables on them. It was mind-blowing. The audio was incredible with a background siren that served to keep you alert, in case being chased by 4 ghosts wasn't tense enough. Intermissions with music and humor happened often. It was such a game changer, and for me, it made an immense impact. I saw that games could be about much more than shooting aliens with a rocket ship. More about shooting later. In 1981, I started high school at Roseville High in Roseville, the next town over. In 1982, my parents finally bought an Apple II computer. Long story short, I spent the next 5 years learning how to code and developed dozens of games. I'm not kidding you when I say that I spent every spare hour programming during that time. I loved summertime when there was no school and I could code from 8 a.m. to midnight every day. At the start of 1983, my family moved to England. The industry had partially burned down in 1983 and 84 when the Atari 2600 market crashed. Consoles were dead. home computer games continued on after several good publishers went down. Of course, the Nintendo saved the console industry in 1985. Did you know that this wasn't even the first console industry crash? There was one in 1977 that was caused by too many Pong clones. During this time, I submitted dozens of my games and utilities to industry magazines and software publishers. I have a stack of rejection notices that remind me of my first taste of failure. In fact, it wasn't just a taste, it was a buffet of failure. It wouldn't be my last. I barely graduated high school, but I learned how to code in 6502 and I wrote 51 games by 1987. I published most of them while in high school and got the cover of a magazine 3 times. By 1987, the game industry had passed its Big Bang phase. Games were still mostly written by indie developers and published by the likes of Sierra, SSI, EA, Origin, and many others. But internal development at publishers had begun as they looked to professionalize their businesses and have total control over the teams making games. But it was the end of the 8-bit era when I got my first industry job at Origin Systems in 1987. Ultima 5, Origin's then current project, would be the last developed on the Apple II platform. After 8 months, I left Origin to co-found my second game company, Inside Out Software. After porting Might and Magic 2 to the Commodore 64, my next project was cancelled by the publisher. It was as clear as the Apple II's beep that the 8-bit era's death spiral had begun. I left my second game company and co-founded my third one, Ideas from the Deep, with a friend of mine, just before we landed jobs at Softdisk in Shreveport, Louisiana. It was the end of the 80s. After working so hard during that decade, writing 56 games, everything I had done was finished. The 8-bit market was done. I had to start all over again in 1989 on the PC, a computer that was new to me. At that time, the game industry was undergoing a major switch from 8-bit to 16-bit. All the old platforms were dying as the PC, Super Nintendo, and Genesis were rising. And I wasn't alone in this massive shift in the industry. Thousands of programmers either made the leap to the next generation or they got left behind. Moby Games is populated with the credits of programmers whose work ends in the 80s. So, it's 1989. SimCity was released this year along with Populous and Prince of Persia. These games were the beginning of amazing franchises that would last decades. Yeah, this is my favorite picture. I worked at Softdisk for a year or so before starting a game-only product called Gamer's Edge. I hired John Carmack and Adrian Carmack into the group and we started making games in August 1990. They are not relatives. A lot of things happened in August of 1990. First, Ultima 6 and The Secret of Monkey Island were released. Ultima 6 was the first Ultima developed on the PC, which really signaled the death of the Apple II. Monkey Island was a revolutionary adventure game. They were both amazing games. While beginning to write our first game together, Slordax, Tom Hall would pop in at night and help with levels because he couldn't help it. He was too excited to know that games were being made just a couple offices away. I would take breaks from coding and play Ultima 6 and Monkey Island while looking up to the successes of these games as a goal that I wanted to reach someday, if only the right conditions would present themselves. While making our games at Gamer's Edge, John Carmack discovered the smooth scrolling tech while reading Michael Abrash's Power Graphics Programming, the graphics book I'd given him. After a huge breakthrough in horizontal scrolling technology, we created a PC version of Super Mario 3's first couple levels complete with enemies, the Tanuki suit, fireballs, and all. Nintendo loved it, but decided against going forward. They wanted to keep their games on their platform. So instead, we decided to create a new game called Commander Keen that would be published by Apogee Software, a shareware game publisher. We had to create 3 games for Keen to be a success, not just one game. Because we needed to do this as fast as possible for Christmas launch, we had to design the game to be an engine that worked on multiple data sets. 3 months and a lot of pizza and Diet Coke later, and we shipped the first Commander Keen trilogy. It was uploaded to the Software Creations BBS in Massachusetts, the biggest gaming BBS in the United States. Now, it's important to note right now that it's the end of 1990. Before starting on Commander Keen, I'd worked for 10 years trying to make the best Apple II games I could, and that 8-bit industry died. Less than 2 years after starting over on the PC, I had made my best game. It was the best game that any of us had made in our careers, and it was the tipping point for us. We were no longer following behind the industry, we were beginning to lead it. As PC Gamer noted in January 2016 in an article titled The 50 Most Important PC Games of All Time, Commander Keen put id Software on the map, and Commander Keen's groundbreaking smooth scrolling on PCs was a revelation in 1990, and it's hard to believe today that the NES was back then capable of things a PC couldn't do. And looking back, I'm humbled to have had a game of mine included in this list for the year 1990 when Secret of Monkey Island was released. We were the only two games noted as being important in 1990 by PC Gamer. We quit working at Softdisk after getting our first royalty check, and Software officially started on February 1st of 1991. In May, John decided he wanted to try his hand at making his first 3D maze game. Tom Hall came up with the design for Hover Tank 1. John was really stressed getting the game made in 2 months, but he did get it done on time. In the summer of 1991, we held what I called the id Summer Seminar, and Apogee brought many of their authors over to our lake house. We demonstrated our new Keen engine tech and gave them lectures on how it worked. Some of those authors licensed our engine, and the modern engine licensing biz was born out of that lake house. In September, we moved the company from Shreveport to Madison, Wisconsin. There were only 4 of us, so it was easy to do. The last half of the year, we made another Commander Keen trilogy. And while working on our second Keen trilogy, we decided to make another 3D maze game and call it Catacomb 3D. This time, the walls were texture mapped. It made a huge difference. This was the first nice-looking implementation of texture mapping in a game. The first example was in a 1985 game called Alternate Reality: The City. Just before Christmas of 1991, Keen 4 was uploaded to the Software Creations BBS once again. And during this time, the Super Nintendo was doing phenomenally well. John Carmack and I used to play F-Zero competitively a lot. Super Mario World was another favorite game at the time. We also played a lot of D&D. We began working on the third Commander Keen trilogy titled The Universe is Toast. We made a VGA parallaxing demo to see how it would look. And while making this demo, John, Adrian, and I decided we didn't want to make another Commander Keen game. We wanted to make another 3D maze game better than Catacomb 3D. So I came up with the idea of making Wolfenstein 3D. We spent 4 months creating the shareware episode, and during that 4 months, we moved the company to Mesquite, Texas in March of 1992 because it was too cold in Wisconsin. We finally got id Software its own office. It was a tiny loft apartment in Mesquite, Texas. We all lived in the same complex so we could walk to work. And we uploaded Wolf 3D on May 5th, 1992 at about 3 a.m. using a modem. We uploaded it to the Software Creations BBS as usual. Scott Miller and George Broussard were over at our apartment while we uploaded. We knew it was going to be big. Wolfenstein 3D was released just 6 weeks after Ultima Underworld. 3D gaming was just beginning on the PC, finally. Earlier in January, Dune 2, the prototypical real-time strategy game, was released, and 1992 was shaping up to be a great year for games. At this time, virtual reality was trying to happen. Dactyl Nightmare was the premier VR game, and it was very low-res and choppy. An outfit in Kentucky wanted to adapt Wolfenstein 3D to VR tech. Tom Hall flew to their studio and helped them adapt it. It was still the experimental stage of VR, so it didn't go anywhere. Interestingly, there was controversy after Wolfenstein was released, mostly in Germany. You see, a majority of the imagery in Wolf 3D was banned in Germany. The game was immediately put on the banned list and then sold illegally under the counter in stores. Another piece of interesting news with Wolfenstein was that Jewish kids loved playing the game because they felt they were getting revenge for their ancestors who suffered in World War II. Still another interesting effect of Wolfenstein was a Vietnam War vet getting cured of his nighttime flashbacks. We got a CompuServe message from him, and he was so happy to have found the game. PC Gamer's 50 Most Important Games article included Wolfenstein 3D. Along with Ultima Underworld and Dune 2, we were the only 3 games noted as being important in 1992 by PC Gamer. We discovered that pushing technology and using it with great game design was a winning strategy. By the end of 1992, the post-Wolf 3D explosion of popularity made up our minds. Our next game was going to be the most amazing game that we could envision. It would be hard to make, but we wanted to make the best game that we could imagine playing. Even before starting work on the game, we decided on a name, Doom. We knew everything tech-wise that we wanted to put in the game, and like idiot savants, we put out a press release that told the world that Doom was going to herald another technical revolution in PC programming. This is the opening paragraph of the press release. The rest of it describes the game. There's a quote from John Carmack in it that says, Wolfenstein is primitive compared to Doom. We're doing Doom the right way this time. Another incredibly important paragraph in the Doom press release is this: an open game. When our last hit, Wolfenstein 3D, was released, the public responded with an almost immediate deluge of homebrewed utilities, map editors, sound editors, trainers, etc., all without any help on file formats or game layout from id Software. Doom will be released as an open game. We'll provide file formats and technical notes for anyone who wants them. People will be able to easily write and share anything from their own map editors to communication network drivers. The entire year of 1993 was filled with so much experimentation. Until then, we'd not experimented too much in our game development. We just made the game, usually in 2 months. Experimentation happened while we were making the game as fast as we could. So we didn't put a hard deadline on shipping Doom. It's done when it's done was our motto. We knew how to ship games fast. Not having a deadline wasn't going to slow us down. We were driven to ship games. At this point, we knew we were in the lead. There would be no games with newer tech and better design creeping up behind us. We were building something we had never seen before. We started feeling invincible just after Wolf 3D was released. Doom's development reinforced it. The invention of the BSP tree was desperately needed, so Carmack did it based on Bruce Naylor's research. 3D level design needed to be taken to the next level. Up to that point, games in 3D had a lot of limitations, so they didn't look great. Doom changed that. Coming up with the best design took the entire time. We removed several elements that didn't matter. We said goodbye to the concepts of lives and score. We had to create an idea of how the game should feel and reinforce that with visual and audio design. Multiplayer mode with co-op and deathmatch had to be created. There were no PC games available that were multiplayer and fast. Doom's deathmatch mode changed everything. We released Doom on December 10th, 1993, and the world of 1994 was surreal. We were on top of the world. We felt that we had created the greatest game we could imagine, and we felt that the world agreed with us. Coming back to the game industry, another big game in 1993 was Myst, but it seemed that entering 1994, the entire world was Doom crazy. Every issue of most game magazines talked about Doom in one way or another. I had never seen anything like it. We cranked out Doom 2 in 8 months for happy fans and new ones who had heard of the shareware version. I worked with Raven Software to make Heretic and Hexen, the medieval shooters. One thing I do regret was not getting a handle on merchandising back then. We had so many characters in our games that we could have turned into t-shirts, plushies, and many other items. Nowadays, there's a lot of places to get really great game merch for all kinds of games. We then spent the next grueling 18 months working on Quake. It was a tough game to make, but after its release, we advanced the first-person shooter again. The game was completely 3D. This is back when there were no GPUs or hardware systems to draw 3D scenes. While working on Quake, we were also working with NVIDIA and other companies to define the future pipelines and feature sets of 3D graphics cards. For the first time, we had internet multiplayer instead of only LAN and modem choices. So back to Quake. Gaming magazines before and after Quake's release were full of articles and commentary on it. And it was recognized by PC Gamer on their top 50 list, just like Wolfenstein 3D and Doom. This time it was for internet multiplayer, full 3D, mouse look as part of 3D FPS gameplay, and having helped to birth Machinima. But Quake is the game that broke the company. I made the decision to leave in January of 1996. It was tremendously difficult to release Quake. After 7 months of crunch mode, I alone uploaded the game to the world on a Saturday. Like a mutual divorce, both sides were ready to split. I left on August 6th. This was also the year of Diablo and Tomb Raider, 2 hits that continue to live 2 decades later. After leaving id, it was a very challenging and strange time because while I was feeling down about leaving, everything in my life was getting more exciting. After Quake, I left id and founded Ion Storm with my old friend Tom Hall. Within days of leaving, I had several big game publishers wanting to work with me. I had decided to start a new company with Tom Hall 8 months earlier, so I spent several months flying around and talking to publishers to figure out who would be the best for our new company, Ion Storm. During our 5-year run, Ion Storm released a couple of great games. We made 4 games at Ion Storm. My biggest taste of failure was with Daikatana. We released a decent real-time strategy game named Dominion that unfortunately came out the day StarCraft did. And Actronox, Tom Hall's Western version of Final Fantasy, and Deus Ex, Warren Spector and Harvey Smith's mixture of first-person shooter and RPG, with great player choices and multiple narrative paths. Deus Ex, released in 2000, was awarded Game of the Year by several magazines. After Necronox was released in 2001, IDOS shut down Ion Storm's Dallas office. Tom and I had to figure out what we were going to do next. We decided to co-found a new company to pursue the new mobile and wireless gaming space. We called the company Monkeystone Games. This was 5 years before the iPhone was released upon the world. The tech back then was a real hassle to program because there were so many different phones and making one work on multiple platforms was a lot of work. Soon enough, Jamdat was acquired by EA for $650 million. The mobile industry was beginning to explode. Games rapidly went from WAP to J2ME to Brew, but the real explosion would happen 5 years later in 2006 with the introduction of the iPhone. We kept Monkeystone running for 5 years, and we had a lot of fun with it. But World of Warcraft had come out in late 2004 and was quickly dominating the MMORPG space. I played Ultima Online when it came out, I saw the insanity of EverQuest hit everyone around me, but until World of Warcraft, I didn't see the hook. In 2005, I co-founded an MMORPG company so I could make a big MMO for kids with stealth math learning in it. We eventually decided to call this company Gazillion Entertainment. I learned a lot developing a game this big with an internal team of 100. MMOs are hard to launch. After 4 years, we had to stop development due to a major limitation of the tech that we had licensed. We had to lay off most of the team, another big failure. I spent 10 months not working on anything. I was watching the rise of Facebook casual gaming, and I thought it would be an important market to get into. I tried to convince Gazillion to enter the space, but eventually the board of directors decided to stay focused on the MMO market. So, I left Gazillion to do some consulting with a small social apps company in San Francisco. After working for less than 3 months, I had shipped my first Facebook game with a small team of 12. The game was called Ravenwood Fair and had astounding success immediately. Within 6 months, the game was being played by 25 million players per month. I put the skeleton of Frontier Jack from Zynga's Frontierville game in the dirt on the loading screen. I learned a lot about microtransactions, monetization models, and what makes people want to spend money. And because of the success of Ravenwood, I co-founded a social game company with my wife Brenda. We named the company Loot Drop. In no time at all, we had 4 games signed up by 4 publishers and hired 40 people to fill the teams. Eventually, after a few years, the social game bubble burst and we put Loot Drop on ice. Then we decided to move to Ireland and start Romero Games on the west coast in Galway. We've been going for 6 years now as indies. Now, before I move into the future, I want to talk about some patterns I've seen in the industry since the beginning. Who here uses Steam to download games? Well, the only difference between using Steam and downloading games from a BBS in the old days is that the speed has gone way up. We've repeated the pattern of digital distribution from the 80s into a faster, sleeker model. Another interesting note is that the RPG company I used to work for, Origin Systems, was bought by EA in 1993 and eventually shut down in 2004. EA is now using that name for their own digital download storefront that competes with Steam, so it looks like the origin cycle is repeating in a different manifestation. The next pattern is multiplayer gaming. When computers entered the home, games became overwhelmingly single-player. For as long as people have played games, they have been mostly multiplayer. Chess, checkers, pretty much all board games, card games, etc. Baseball, basketball, football, games have always been multiplayer. But now, with the new home computer, they're single player. Doom came at the right time when local area networking was emerging and modems were everywhere. Doom broke the single player spell of the previous 20 years since the start of the computer game industry. The next pattern is eSports, which depends on multiplayer having been popularized. Following the release of Doom, LAN parties became popular. People began lugging their huge CRT monitors and huge towers to their friends' houses for a weekend of deathmatch. After Quake in 1996, team-based deathmatch tournaments got big. Clans formed and real competition began with cash prizes. Several leagues sprung into existence. The number of people attending CPL events were in excess of 5,000. Most of these people brought their own computers to the events. Quake was the prime game used in eSports for years, then it shifted to Counter-Strike. This is a recent League of Legends tournament. And guess what? eSports started in the 80s with the arcade boom. There were arcade tournaments for several years with cash prizes given away to the big winners. If you've heard of the movie King of Kong, you might remember that a couple of main players met at a 1982 arcade tournament. Tournaments were happening everywhere back then. The official scores were kept on the Twin Galaxies website, and they still are. The next pattern is story in games. Games that were mainly stories were called adventure games. They always had puzzle elements in them. Recently, the question of what is a game has surfaced. Computer games are not games, according to people who played D&D and board games back in the 70s. Console games are not games, according to computer game players of the 80s. There was a huge issue when the C was dropped from the Computer Game Developers Conference and became the GDC in 1999 to include all platforms, not just computers. As we expand the boundary of games, people question whether it's a game at all. Is Gone Home a game? Is Life is Strange a game? Is Her Story a game? Yes, I think they are. When we push the boundary of games, when we experiment with the medium to see what it can do, there are always those who will question if this new work at the edge is actually still within the boundary when it has, in fact, just pushed it. The next pattern is violence in games. Games are only the latest form of media to be blamed for violence. Comic books and heavy metal and many others were attacked before video games were. While games were entertainment, they were also very much about war and conflict practice. Chess, for instance, and war games arose from those games. Governments have been investing in game-like technology for over 40 years. Dungeons & Dragons spawned its own outcry. Death Race 2000 heralded the loudest outcry in the 70s, but it was followed by Mortal Kombat, Night Trap, and of course my own games. In a case of incredible timing, the day after the congressional hearings on video game violence, we released Doom on December 10th, 1993. I believe games, however, are cultural, and I believe the violence that we see in the world goes beyond games. Plenty of countries play games. Canada, Germany, Japan, England, they are all hardcore consumers of games, yet we don't see similar outbreaks of violence in these countries. It's not the game, it's the gun. It's not the computer, it's the culture. It's not the player. Let me change my last topic. Where are we going as an industry? Well, there's currently high interest and investment in AR and VR technologies. Everyone's trying to find a new way to see games and play games. At some point, VR will be marketed as another console, which it is. Are you playing a game on Xbox, PS5, Switch, or Quest? Augmented reality has immediate and wide-ranging applications if seen through your phone's camera. Mobile gaming gets more incredible every year. There's constant experimentation with how 3D games can be best played on a smartphone. And games are getting more social, which is where they really find huge success. Combine new technologies and new design together, and you know what can happen. Procedural generation is going to reach a more impressive level as programmers and designers apply and discover more advanced techniques, such as machine learning, and procedural generation will be moving over to GPUs to generate all the objects you see in a game, even terrain. Procedural synthesis might be implemented in popular engines as plugins, much the way SpeedTree handles foliage generation. Procedural synthesis algorithmically generates textures. Soon, all our games' graphics will be described by formulas. This technique has been used since the early 80s on the Commodore 64, Atari 800, and later computers for demo scene entries. I still believe that games have to have great design to be successful. Tech by itself is not enough, but great tech combined with great design is a huge win. What does all this great technology and design mean? It means what it's always meant. We're going to continue to have even more amazing games. Thank you.